36 interviews over 14 years, or rather, 36 different Q&As, interviews, or video pieces. That's what I analyzed to try and figure out Hajime Isayama's character arc as he drew Attack on Titan. I recognize the limitations of not being a Japanese speaker here, but I used these alongside general biographical information to find answers. How did this man's mental state impact the development of AOT? How does his work reflect his own worldviews? How did he deal with the brutal world of the manga industry? And is he doing okay? Join me as we look into this weird, childish man with self-esteem issues trying to figure himself out while grappling with his work. But hey, that's what being in your 20s is supposed to be about, right? Let's dive in. There are 4 aspects of Isayama's current personality that actually developed in his childhood. This was where his villain origin story started. You won't believe number 3. It was so bad, he actually refused to talk about his childhood at all when asked about it in his early mangaka years. We'll go through these in the order they developed. Number 1, a vivid imagination and deep interest in storytelling. Isayama would draw monsters all the time, thanks to good old dinosaurs. Their immense size and unique characteristics are very appealing. The monsters he drew would always be in battle, either fighting robots or under artillery fire. He also really liked having the protagonist transform in order to become stronger. Just think, Attack on Titan version -1 before the one-shot could have looked like this. Along with the drawings came improvised stories. Whenever he'd play with toys, a lot of the stories from one play session would end up connecting to others in strange ways. He even attributes this habit to AOT story scenarios, like having Gabby taken in by Sasha's family after having killed Sasha herself. Number 2, he follows his own rules. This kid's disregard for rules and comfort with self-expression went so far that he'd write about random topics in school reports rather than the ones instructed. Check out his junior high yearbook responses.
His dream of the future? Selling cellophane tape. How would he be reborn? As a mammal.
A weed. Isayama thinks of his childhood self as an eccentric person, but he wasn't bothered by this, he just felt he had to do things differently. To Isayama, non-conformity was a way of expressing his imagination, something he did a lot of in AOT. Normally, so long as it's nurtured, these characteristics can correlate with developments in communication skills and self-assurance. But for Isayama, it was quite the opposite. Number 3, inferiority complex. This was the main reason he can't look back at his childhood fondly. Isayama felt worse at everything when compared to other kids. Sports, school, public speaking. This was in full force by his middle school years and would not stop ever. He desperately wanted to be special, but he didn't see how he could. Isayama credits his past of being a skinny kid, unable to compete with others physically, as influencing how he writes female characters. From his fan meeting at Anime NYC, why do I draw female characters like that? When I came up with the characteristics of the soldiers, I didn't want any of them to have physical disadvantages, so I ignored those aspects when I developed their attributes. I think he was eventually able to come to terms with his childhood he hated, at least a little bit. By 2018, there was a visible difference in his attitude whenever the topic came up. Look, he was actually smiling and even laughed at a certain page when looking through his yearbook. And by the way, that's a rare occurrence. The typical video interview with Isayama is him being a little awkward at first before eventually warming up, then maintaining a neutral facial expression with neutral body language. Number 4, the desperation to be a mangaka. So Isayama really started getting into manga and video games in junior high school, though he's dabbled in them for much longer. The escapism aspect is what drew him in. Not wanting to face the unpleasant reality of studying, he started seriously considering becoming a mangaka. The biggest issue is that Isayama was terrible at drawing. After a lot of practice, this is what the original AOT one-shot looked like years after this point. No one appreciated his work in high school, but there was still a part of him that thought he was a genius, that he had something special here. It's interesting that he still wanted to believe in his art, especially when he accepts and exaggerates all other negative aspects of himself. His own family didn't even believe he could pull off being a mangaka. I think he needed to hold on to the one thing he was passionate about, that he could see turning into a career. But whatever semblance of that inner worth he did have would be shattered once more after starting his design program in college. He saw people who were way better than him, and it must have felt like a repeat of his younger years. Isayama made it a goal to leave his home, hoping it would force him to become a better person. He grew up in Oita Prefecture, which is an area encompassed by mountains. This city was his entire world up until college, and he needed to escape the walls surrounding it. He was literally Child Aaron. It was as if titans lurked outside these mountains. But remember how I mentioned he would eventually come to terms with his childhood? His more recent opinion on his hometown. No matter how cruel and harsh the world may be, I can withstand it because I have this place. Isayama would become thankful to the people living there and develop a desire to give back to them. He did in fact move out though, and eventually started working at an internet cafe in Tokyo while pursuing a career in writing manga. And so begins the journey of constant rejection in attempts to get a manga serialized. Isayama's work was a hard sell due to his art primarily. After countless rejections, he would eventually meet Shintaro Kawakubo, the man who would eventually become the editor for Attack on Titan. Kawakubo was the first industry professional to say that his work was good, but Isayama obviously had a tough time believing it. Kawakubo could see how much emotion Isayama was able to put on each page. There was something here, it just needed some refinement. Just look at how his one-shots were doing. It was with this editor's guidance that Isayama's career would begin. Kawakubo explained that Isayama had a constant fear of failure in him. In his mind, this manga career was the only option. If it failed, he'd have to go back to working part-time jobs because he sucked at everything else. It was this terror, this struggle to the death, which became a major motivator in Isayama's early career. Even with this pressure, Isayama was pretty calculated. He would often ask himself questions like these while still drawing what he wanted to draw. Isayama has always been good at figuring out how to leave an impression on readers. A common strategy he employs involves taking experiences from media that impacted him and dissecting them to figure out what parts were appealing. He then applies that to his own work, but he tries not to be formulaic either. Isayama doesn't like manga that rely on trends and market research. He wants to see new stuff. But back to trying to get published. When Isayama first heard from the Weekly Shonen magazine office that they wanted to serialize AOT monthly, he describes his reaction as, having his manga be finally acknowledged by a publisher made him very happy, but the fear of failure did not go away. It just evolved into a constant fear of the series getting axed. He would spend the next 6 months constantly thinking about the story. His lack of confidence was not hidden well. Kawakubo could see it plain as day, even stating, "I think he's someone who doesn't want to be embarrassed about his life. He doesn't want to be uncool. For example, some people might think, I want to be popular. I want to be rich." There are various motivations in the world, but Isayama simply doesn't want to be uncool. This is just what I think. Isayama was completely aware of how tough it was to make it as a mangaka. His dream, not goal, dream, was just to make enough to feed himself. He was even convinced the manga probably wouldn't survive 2 volumes, and was prepared to end it then if needed. It's not like he didn't think AOT was a good idea though. He thought it was fascinating and relatable. There was just this constant feeling that he was just a kid underestimating how tough it was out here. Fast forward a few years, and Isayama is still writing with a lack of confidence and terror in the back of his mind. The manga is picking up a lot of tension and seeing success. Now that he's in the flow, he thinks making manga is equal parts tough and fun. In 2012, he mentioned that he doesn't have an exact message he wants to convey in AOT. He just wants to spread his self-consciousness around. He said he thinks of himself as a child and cannot imagine sending out a positive message. The classic quote, "To be straight, I want to use manga to inflict harm on others." Expressing childhood angst and frustrations in your work, huh? Isayama admits he used to think along the lines of this statement. He often wondered what it would be like to live in a world without people, and he didn't quite like how it was coming out. When describing his own work, he said, "If there's a character to my work, it'd be a sort of endless adolescence," which he hated. Isayama likes mature, smart, cool characters. This is what he set out to create, but it became clear to him that this just wasn't what he was producing. The general impression is that AOT does have mature and complex themes, right? Why does Isayama think that his characters aren't mature or cool? So a mangaka's characters reflect some aspect of themselves. Could be a thought, a motivation, or an emotion, but it's something that the creators themselves embodied at some point. Isayama kind of hates himself. What he is writing is a reflection of his inner child that he was dissatisfied with, and that's why he feels like AOT doesn't have mature, smart, or cool characters. So naturally, Isayama doesn't believe the praise his work is getting is deserved, and he even feels guilty about it. To him, luck is half of what determines success. This negativity would go so far that he believes he needs to be critical and self-deprecating to avoid losing his grip. Normally, this behavior worsens self-esteem and mental health. I'm actually quite surprised he didn't self-sabotage by avoiding risks and playing it safe. He took a lot of risks, though he did hesitate with each one. This behavior can also strain relationships, except Isayama was already very lonely. Around the time of volume 9, he mentions, "Even though the manga I was drawing was popular and I was making enough money to live on, I still had a complex in my mind that I was not a good person. And that didn't make me feel happy. When I'm walking down the street in the middle of the night, there are times when I feel inferior, like I'm a useless, helpless, lowly creature, and to cheer myself up I sometimes mutter, 'No, I'm a genius mangaka.' This is so depressing." The only friends he had at this time were also his 2 assistants he worked with. And the cherry on top, Isayama would literally go through all the comments on the internet about Attack on Titan when it started. After it got to a point where it was impossible to go through all of them, he would still keep reading, a habit that kept going until the end of the series. Isayama just kept moving forward under these conditions. They provided heavy motivation to plan out the story and to make it as good as possible. I'm sure you've heard it before, but Isayama had an outline of the story, including an ending, before AOT was published. But the key thing to note note is it's just an outline. The details would not be fleshed out until it was time to draw it, and this is something he continually reiterated in pretty much every interview since the beginning. Soon after publication began, further story details were figured out in collaboration with Kawakubo, including why Eren became a Titan, the fact that there were traitors around, and the origin of the story. But I think this framework is a lot more meticulous than Isayama gives it credit for. Like, he gave Levi the strength he has and figured out ways to keep him away from the front lines for so long, all because his strength would eventually be needed for where the story goes. Even with all this planning, he would continuously regret not having done certain things in the manga, but would use the anime to try and fix those. One of the big ones at the beginning was sacrificing depth in order to move the story along and keep it from feeling boring. To make up for this, Levi's squad were given more personality in the anime. The goal was to develop them so much that the audience would think there's no way they'd die so soon. Now, I did say equal parts tough and fun. Isayama had the most fun drawing battle scenes and could enter a state of full concentration and energy when doing so. He especially liked chapter 44 with Eren versus Reiner. He felt a great sense of accomplishment since this fight actually adapts various martial arts techniques into the choreography. This was the kind of content he originally loved drawing after all. Season 1 of the anime is out. AOT popularity is booming, but to Isayama, the more successful the work gets, the less real it feels. He mentioned, "I had many important events as a mangaka, such as the Attack on Titan exhibition and TV anime, and I always worried whether I was aware of reality. I felt like I was being swept up in some kind of unfathomable current, and I couldn't help myself. I felt like I was being left behind." Makes sense, it's disrupting Isayama's sense of identity and self-image. But even by 2014, Isayama had yet to understand Eren. He saw the character as the story's slave. Eren only exists to act out the role the story needs. This is why Eren would only be depicted with what Isayama calls a good side so far. I have to assume Kawakubo did push Isayama to try and figure this out, but he couldn't find an answer. Isayama asked the anime staff if they could do something about that and portray Eren with more flaws. It was because of the anime that Isayama would come to start liking Eren. He started seeing the character as an actual person, not just a tool, and that portrayal would start to influence how he wrote Eren in the manga. This is a significant contrast to how he normally develops characters. His usual approach is to figure out their appearance and then determine their personalities based on what best matches their face. Eren is a lot more generic than the other characters. He's probably got the least defining traits of them all. I can see why Isayama would struggle to work with this. However, I would claim that because he didn't know what to do with Eren, he was subconsciously inserting an aspect of himself into the character. Specifically, an aspect of his frustrated childhood self. Eren's childhood in the story already reflects Isayama's to some extent. His ideal character, on the other hand, is someone who doesn't lie. Specifically, someone who doesn't twist their original will. Isayama likes those who rise up against the entire world, and finds those who become pawns of the storyline unattractive. Though Eren would literally rise up against the entire world later on, he is often twisting his own resolve and lying to himself a lot. Reminds me of Isayama a little. Given his preferences, Isayama's favorite character was Jean for much of the run so far. He likes his tells it like it is attitude. By 2017, his favorite started shifting to Reiner, though this was because he saw Reiner as carrying the burden of self-reflection on Isayama's behalf, since he was the cause of a lot of unfortunate events for the Survey Corps. He can empathize with them. In these middle years, Isayama is totally aware he's putting his personal frustrations into his work, but despite that, he didn't think he was putting a bit of himself into Eren. It was only by the end of this period where he started to empathize with him. The reason was because of the enormous pressure both Isayama and Eren were under. It was around 2016 when Isayama started contemplating whether he was actually capable of finishing AOT. He even considers that it might be okay if he isn't able to complete it. This conflict comes from feeling an increase in responsibility now that AOT is so big. The pressure is immense, but even so, he does want to finish it, to release himself from the burden, becoming a free person as he puts it. I don't know if his continuation of reading internet commentary about AOT was helping, but he says he starts to worry if he only hears good things. Despite this, he does get angry over the criticism sometimes. He can occasionally overdose on it. As far as the arcs in this time period go, well, the Uprising or Royal Government arc was one of Isayama's roughest in his opinion. When Eren was wavering and thinking that he should have just died, Isayama wasn't sure if this was a good move, but years later he feels that it might have been the right decision since Eren was eventually able to strengthen his resolve and evolve as a character. Isayama was still anxious about whether he was able to manage conveying the reasoning behind this by 2019. But despite not being happy with the arc as a whole, two of his favorite chapters in the series are from this arc, Chapter 71 Bystander and Chapter 69 Friends. Isayama Isayama likes these because he was able to achieve more than he's usually capable of in these chapters. He likes that they're different from the main story and can stand out on their own. For chapter 69 in particular, he mentions thinking something along the lines of, I'm a bit of an adult now, when drawing it. Characters like these are probably the ones he originally wanted to draw, the ones he thinks are cool, mature, and smart. Once he got to the Shiganshina arc, it seems like Isayama had a good grasp of what he wanted to convey. He's able to talk confidently and in detail about the small things, like mirroring the beginning of the series with these scenes. He also talks in detail about the ocean scene and the symbolism behind the shell in a manner I usually don't see in his other interviews. He even said what we've all thought at one point or another. Regarding that scene, from the very beginning I've always wanted to make it appear ominous. If I had to admit it, there's also a feeling of, wouldn't this be a pretty good final chapter? One of his goals from this point on was to try and draw more development for Armin. He's faced all his struggles with the motivation of seeing the sea, but now that it's been accomplished, where does he go from here? Isayama has many moments in mind he wants to depict. So then I have to ask, was the Connie side quest from season 4 part 2 one of these scenes? Its story placement always seemed a bit strange. By 2017, Isayama now feels that Eren being dragged along by the story is the essence of Eren's character. Great, on to the Marley arc. The 5 days leading up to the deadline for chapter 91, The Other Side of the Ocean, were very intense and supposedly the most fun he's had drawing manga up to this point. He was able to feel the sense of fear and pain of the drawing process, but also the sense of progress and development. Always gotta balance his enjoyment with some pain and anxiety. He started being especially attentive to readers' opinions when this arc started, which is understandable. We don't see our main crew for a while. How would people respond to that? The idea of abandoning the Survey Corps for a while was planned well in advance, but when it was finally time to draw it, Isayama's anxiety went through the roof. It seems to me like he even considered running away from it at some point. His rationalization was this: in order to reintroduce Eren as an enemy, I couldn't change the development I had planned, and I was in a difficult situation at the time. He does this a lot. Whenever Isayama takes risks with a story, he gets pretty nervous about it himself, but it's something he wants to do anyways. This is what makes the story interesting to him. Reflecting on the story developments in this time period, they represent Isayama's view on how it can be difficult to pass judgment on what is right and what is wrong. He uses the case of a serial killer from this manga to illustrate his point. If a serial killer is born this way, if it's in his nature to be like this, either due to his life or his background, is it actually his fault? Is it just a coincidence that you weren't born under these conditions that would make you a killer? We would eventually start to see this manifest best in Eren. Isayama became less lonely over time at this point too. His daily life became more enjoyable and he'd eventually move to a new office and get more assistants, with whom his relationship continued to deepen. But you know how brutal being a mangaka can be. Very long hours, very little free time. Your sleep pattern is a mess. Becoming ill and even dying from overworking is common. So how's Isayama faring? We do know a bit about his daily life though, and I think it illustrates a stranger side. He handles writing chapters exactly the way a college student handles projects. The chapter is due at the end of the month. So in the following month, he first takes a rest week, then follows it with 3 weeks straight of just working. 1 week storyboarding and planning, 2 weeks drawing, 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. He recently mentioned, as each deadline approached, I no longer cared about drawing well, about satisfying the reader, or about the number of copies sold. What I was obsessed with was this fateful date of delivery. It was such a pain that, to free myself from it, I was willing to sacrifice the quality of my drawing. Now, I get this. This was me in university. If it's the night before a lab is due, the grade doesn't matter anymore. I just want to get it done in time. But wow. He also holds his pen weirdly. Isayama explained that good manga artists move their wrists in all directions, so they tend to suffer from tendinitis. He does this.
Wow.
He truly is a genius. Isayama would also get exercise in, which goes a long way, though it of course couldn't be conventional exercise. He's sometimes overcome by the urge to run, so he'll go sprinting. He owns a sandbag and enjoys kicking it very much. He's also got a chin-up bar. Isayama needs to feel muscle soreness in his arms, or else he feels like he's atrophying. He might actually be atrophying for all I know. This guy claims he needs to force himself to eat and has a terrible sleep schedule. His itch to exercise might actually have been the thing that saved him from some massive damage, both mentally and physically. It seems his need for this comes from being able to recognize a sense of growth through pain. He thinks this is the kind of person you are if you want to be a mangaka. Despite failure, criticism, rejection, you can still absorb nutrients from those experiences. If you can manage to discover happiness for that reason, that's a talent in itself. AOT is now massive, yet Isayama still can't believe the success his manga has had. He actually still thinks it's just a fad that will soon pass. He got married in 2018, which was the catalyst for a bit of a transformation. Isayama seemed generally happier, though is still very anxious and unconfident, and he believes he gradually became able to draw the way he wanted to, even crediting his assistants largely for that. He got more sentimental about his past at this point. This is actually when that interview where he looked through his yearbook and talked about his hometown positively took place. This had the most apparent influence on how he portrayed Reiner from the Marley arc onwards. He states, "I wanted to portray Reiner that way because I got married while I was working on the series, which was probably an important factor. Before I got married, I was naive enough to think that as long as I drew Attack on Titan, I would be forgiven for my lack of social skills. But after I got married, I had to interact with my wife's family, cook, clean my room, and do many other things besides drawing manga. I can't be negligent. If I hadn't married, I would probably still feel like a high school student, and I think my mental growth has influenced my work in some way." As the arc continued, we got another fight scene Isayama is very proud of, the Eren vs Warhammer Titan fight. While finding it difficult to draw, he had a lot of fun with it, even continually looking at it again and again in awe. He is very attached to his work. In reference to his storyboards, he said, "I keep them. I really can't bear the thought of getting rid of them. I feel they are pieces of paper that have gone through incredible hardship with me. Perhaps I'll ultimately have them put in my coffin." Progressing into the final arc of the story, Isayama would be a bit more susceptible to run from his gambles now, though he had a lot more gambles in general. In a 2019 interview with Kawakubo, he mentions that Isayama changed the story a bit at the last moment in volume 28. Maybe this was a good call. We probably won't ever know what the original plan was. He thought whatever happened was too naive and didn't like the progression, but Kawakubo comments that he has this opinion that if he himself isn't sure about something or thinks it's too complicated, then there's no way it can be interesting to read. So it feels a bit like he runs from the problems, which doesn't exactly suggest it was straight up bad. It seems like Kawakubo would have preferred if Isayama fixed it rather than changing it altogether. It is a noticeable contrast to previous decision making. He just pushed forward when it came to the Uprising arc and the Marley arc, but maybe that's because he had no choice if he wanted to progress the story in those other two scenarios. When asked about the meaning of his work in this period, his answer remains the same. No specific message, but rather an expression of his personal frustrations. "I think I wanted to attack something, like betraying people or hurting people. And well, it's not exactly nice, but hurting the readers too." For me as a reader, when I think this manga will remain in my heart, it means, for example, it phenomenally hurt me. It's those kinds of experiences that I'm after. If pressed for an answer though, he'd say the message is something like this: we can all become aggressors. We can think we're victims while being aggressors. Having some doubts can be a good thing. That's something I've tried to put in my work lately. That is indeed what we got. Eren's actions reflect his desire for destruction. More specifically, Isayama's not talking about destroying civilization or annihilating mankind, but turning the world upside down. I think this is where he's finally come to terms with Eren. When asked which character reflects himself or is most like him, he said Dad. But it might be partially a joke. He genuinely looked like he was having fun at this event. A year later, he said, "I initially thought perhaps Armin, but lately, I'd say it's maybe Eren after all. Initially, I believed this type of character was necessary for the story, so I wrote him in. With him came something of a feeling that he was a part of an inner me that I really didn't want to see. He really wanted to be like Armin and thought he was on track for that in 2016. Armin is supposed to be capable of anything, even when he's trying to tackle a difficult goal. But instead, you're not so different, you and Eren." In 2019, things with Eren are different. Up until he saw the ocean, he was the slave of the story. After seeing the ocean, he became a character that pulls the story along, and his inner psychology hasn't been revealed yet. Conversely to how it was before, the driving force right now is, I don't understand what the protagonist is thinking, but the problem of being a slave will continue to be a focal point from now on. Nearing the home stretch, the anxiety about the ending is as big as ever. As he states in 2020, "As for how will the character's emotions be drawn, I really cannot know until I have done it for real." This is one of the unpredictable points regarding the form of the conclusion. He's been mentioning this immense pressure every time the topic of the ending has come up, ever since it picked up popularity. He's still contemplating whether he's capable of ending it too. Okay, let's start this one with a visualization. It's a hectic Monday morning at the office. We have an important project to finish. Tight deadline. Due end of day. Several companies we collaborate with are depending on this. You arrive at your desk. It's chaos. Papers are strewn everywhere. Emails are piling up. Every Slack group chat is blasting messages. As you sit down, colleagues are requesting updates. Clients are seeking clarifications. And your manager is anxiously checking in. The pressure mounts as you realize the weight of the task ahead. The clock on the wall ticks relentlessly, each passing minute reminding you of the looming deadline. You feel the weight of expectations bearing down on you as minutes slip by. It's now past lunchtime. lunchtime. We didn't go for lunch. The stress is taking a toll. Your heart races, your palms sweat. Despite your best efforts, the workload seems insurmountable and doubt creeps in. The pressure to meet the deadline weighs heavily on your shoulders. Fatigue sets in, but you can't afford to rest. Finally, as the clock ticks closer to the deadline, a glimmer of hope emerges. With a final burst of determination, you channel your focus and prioritize tasks, making tough decisions to complete the essential elements. The deadline is here. You submit your work, a mixture of relief and anticipation washing over you. Exhausted but hopeful, you take a moment to catch your breath, reflecting on the intense journey that led to this point. That's the vibe. Look at how happy he is on the other side. Ever since AOT started gaining popularity, Isayama was always hesitant as to whether he should write a more responsible ending or the one he originally intended. Now it was time to actually draw it, and like every time he had to draw a gamble before, he was terrified. He was balancing bearing the burden of wanting to live up to fan expectations, but also to go against them. Where the compromise landed, I cannot say, but I can give you this. Soon after the final chapter's release, it was a hard time for me because I had to sit and draw with my hands for more than 2 weeks. But in the end, I was surprised to discover that I had more energy and that I could even enjoy drawing. During serialization, the writing process must have been routine. In the final chapter, I didn't feel like I was in a routine. I was drawing what I wanted to draw, and it was really fresh, so I enjoyed it. He even took pictures with his editor and assistants and sees it as a good memory. He still finds reality difficult to accept, but he now feels at peace. But that was soon interrupted, because you know, the ending was controversial. Given how much Isayama reads internet comments, he was quick to pick up on that, and mentioned soon after the release. In the last part of the story, I realized that the theme was too difficult for me to draw, and I really regret that I couldn't express it in my drawings properly. After 11.5 years of work, when I finished my last manuscript, I really thought that I would be able to make everyone happy, but I think I was overconfident. I'm sorry for those of you who supported me and I let you down in the end. After those additional pages for the final chapter dropped, there wasn't any new work to criticize in the next year that followed, but I imagine this ending reception was still looming in Isayama's mind. Given his personality, there's no way he didn't suffer emotional distress and lowered self-esteem from it. He didn't exhibit defensive behavior, as expected. He's not really that protective of his ego. I'm guessing he went through a cycle of self-criticism. He internalized negative feedback, constantly berated himself, and focused way more on the flaws. In terms of motivational impact, I'm sure it only reinforced his choice not to make another serialization, but we saw that he at least still provided feedback to Hayashi and the production team for the next season of the final season that aired early 2022. It seems to me like he was finally able to confront this feeling properly when Anime NYC rolled around near the end of 2022. Before the event began, he mentioned this statement provided by Kodansha. I am aware that the ending of Attack on Titan was quite controversial. I am open to receiving people's honest opinions. However, I would appreciate it if you'd be kind to me. The experience was quite the opposite of Isayama's initial concerns. In the actual panel itself, he was met with a thunderous applause when stepping onto the stage, and then repeated bouts of cheers and support as the panel went on. He did eventually have to confront the topic of the ending here. Skipping the parts referencing plot points, he mentions, I still have doubts within myself. Did I land it? I'm not even so sure, and I still struggle on this point, and I'm very sorry about that. Which was met with... And then he says...
I try not to cry.
This had to have meant a lot. At the same event, in a Crunchyroll interview, he mentioned, whenever I look back at the story that I wrote, I have so many things I wish I could have done differently. It's almost hard to name exactly what that was. Every time I look back on my stories, I'm always thinking about, you know, remorse and regret is what I feel from looking back on my own stories. And to be met with the reaction he got on that stage, it had to have felt similar to the time an editor first acknowledged his work after repeated rejections. From that point on, he seemed like he was experiencing a mess of emotions internally. His answers to questions shortened immensely, which is fair. I would have a difficult time thinking after that. When asked about if he'd make a new manga, when asked what freedom meant to him,
I don't know.
these were questions Isayama answered in the past, he just couldn't bring up the words. He had a fan meetup here too and got to hear words of support, up close and personal. After the event ended, he said, when I was carrying those heavy feelings and was in a rut for a long time until about yesterday, I had signings and got to talk to fans one-on-one, and many told me the ending was awesome. Those kind words really hit me, and I feel great gratitude to come to NYC and meet you all. It was a great experience for me. Isayama's 2023 interviews generally reflected on his mangaka experience as a whole, but his outlook on the ending seems a bit more neutral now. He thinks he could have done better, that he didn't put all of his strength into it, but he drew what he wanted despite the flawed execution, and he is satisfied. And look, you can make the case that he didn't actually draw what he wanted, or that he changed his idea last minute, or he got convinced to stray from his original idea. He had an outline, not fleshed out details after all. Any of these are possible based on what we know of his character and history of decision making, but you have to remember that he's also the kind of person who draws what he wants, and has repeatedly stated that. If he did end up changing his plan, it seems likely to me that he was intrinsically motivated to make that change as well. That brings us to current day. Much like all of us, Isayama probably won't have complete closure until the anime is complete and he stops needing to give feedback or work on AOT in any capacity. So, is he doing okay? I hope so. I think he's doing a lot better than when he started, at least. From the beginning of his career to now, he's improved his communication skills, matured quite a bit, and made lifelong friends. He's still definitely quite self-critical, but he's very grateful for the opportunities he's gotten and is glad to have gone through the hardships he has. But keep moving forward, Isayama. You did good. This video wasn't about the fan reaction to that ending. If you're interested in that, check out the video on screen. Though keep in mind, that's my first ever video, so go easy on the presentation.